Recognized Uncle Walker D01. Recognized James Introcaso D24.
Hello, team. Today in the cave, I'm honored to have James Introcaso with us. James is a Gold ENnie winning game designer and the co-founder of the Don't Split the Podcast network, which includes shows such as Tabletop Babble, DSPN Presents, Game O'Clock, and the incredible actual play podcast, The Venture Maidens. James is also the co-creator and co-star of the comedy radio drama Have Spellbook Will Travel. Have Spellbook is a highly produced radio play in the vein of modern classics like Hello from the Magic Tavern, and is the funniest, most entertaining podcast in my personal feed. James also happens to be one of the kindest, most supportive people in the podcast industry. So, James, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Wow, thank you so much for having me and for these kind words. I'm sure your listeners know that you are the kindest and most supportive person in the podcast industry. So that means a lot coming from you. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Before we begin, I want to remind everyone that our discussion episodes draw on anything and everything related to Young Justice, including both seasons of the series so far, the comics, and the video game. If you've not seen, read, or played all the material and are spoiler wary, please consider this your warning. And with all that, let's dive in. So, James, I touched on a few amazing things that you do in the world in the intro, but tell us a little more about who you are and what you do.
Sure. So my name is James Introcaso, and I do role-playing game design. I do a lot of stuff with 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons. I'm one of the DMs Guild adepts. I'm part of the Adventurers League, and I'm a proud co-founder of the Don't Split the Podcast network. You rattled off many of our awesome shows. We've got even more Dames and Dragons, the DM's Deep Dive. So if people are interested in role-playing games, they should check that out. And we have great guests like Rich Howard come on and host actual plays for us and that kind of thing. I'm also, this is of interest probably to your audience, a television writer and producer. Yes. And I do a lot of television promos these days, but I did work at Cartoon Network back in 2010 and 2011. When
I did not know that. I knew that you worked. Didn't you work for National Geographic at some point doing some things? Was it National Geo, or am I misremembering?
Yes. So before I worked at National Geographic, I was at Turner working for Adult Swim and Cartoon Network. But yes, then I went on to work at National Geographic for 4 years in their creative marketing department, which is where I discovered the joy of promos. Because the joy of promos is it's like making television, but you get to leave at 6 o'clock every day, and you get to have your weekends free, and you get to work on role-playing game products and podcasts and things like that. So, yes, but before that I did show production, and I was over there working on a show on Cartoon Network. Not Young Justice. But that's sort of my my background here. So yeah, I'm very, very excited to be here because I am also just a lifelong nerd and lover of comic books. I was telling you earlier, I grew up with the Timverse animated Batman series that turned into Batman Superman, that turned into Justice League, that turned into Justice League Unlimited and Batman Beyond. And so it's really, really a pleasure to be able to talk about these things because I think Young Justice is an amazing evolution of those cartoons.
I agree with you. So when did you first see Young Justice then? Did you see it on DVD, on Netflix? Did you watch it during the original run?
So this is really interesting because I was there at Cartoon Network when the first season launched, and I did not watch it then. I started to watch this show probably about your third or fourth podcast episode. I started to dive in because you and I are friends.
Our third or fourth podcast episode?
Yeah, you and I are friends, and I was like, I want to do this thing that is I want to listen to this thing that is clearly very important to my friend Rich. But to do that, I have to watch this other thing, and so I was like, all right, I'll watch it. And man, was it amazing! And so I can remember the talk around Cartoon Network being like, the ratings aren't that good, but it's a good show. It's a good show. But maybe it's not what kids are interested in anymore. Maybe they want, Adventure Time style. And of course, from that we get Teen Titans Go, which is another conversation that we could have, I'm sure. But yeah, so I didn't watch it then, and I sort of wish I had, and I sort of wish I had gotten more tapped into what was going on with this show when I was at Cartoon Network, but I was not. So yeah, I started to watch it on Netflix, and I watched the whole run, and I'm glad I did because it's not on Netflix anymore.
Yeah.
So so I watched the whole run, and I loved it. I burned through it so fast. Just a really, really amazing piece of fiction, whether or not. Like, the thing that I loved about it was they do such a good job explaining the DC universe to people. Like, you could know nothing other than, the basics of who Batman and Superman are, and you get this show. And I loved that because my knowledge of the DC universe is probably wider than it is deep. And so this really, I felt like, helped give me a lot of depth to these characters. Like, I knew who they were, but I didn't know what made up the core of a lot of these characters. And that was excellent. I thought they do a great job with that.
Yeah, we've definitely had a lot of listeners to the show, and even guests on the show talk about how Young Justice ended up being an on-ramp for them. And even Emily, my second season co-host, talked about how the show literally got her into a comic book store for the first time.
Wow.
And also talking about the opposite, which is where DC Comics, they continue to do these reboots and things to try and get people, involved, or trying to create on-ramps for people to get involved. But even with the reboots, it's really tough. Like, you either alienate, in some way, you either restart lots of things, which may or may not honor the history of the characters, that might put off, old school readers, so new people can get in, which I think is important. Or you just kind of tweak things a little bit, and then that way the new people still kind of don't know what's going on, but the older people like myself are a little more satisfied. It's got to be a really hard line to walk. But the Young Justice kind of hit that demographic, right? That Venn diagram between like old school honoring and brand new people being able to jump on board. My wife has never read a comic. She goes to like Marvel movies and stuff with me, but I really wanted her to watch it, and she was like, okay, I'll give it a try. And by episode 4 or 5, she was like, okay, this is not what I was expecting at all. Like, this is about, like, she's a teacher. She's a high school teacher. So she was like, oh my God, this dynamic between Superman and Superboy is crazy. I didn't expect that, or, all of like the parental dynamics and the sidekick to adult dynamics, right? That kind of thing. Well, but so let's start this off. So there are many, many things that I can say about you, James, but one of the most important here is that between your writing credits, your professional day job, your years in podcasting, and the brilliance that is Have Spellbook Will Travel, you know story and you know character. So when we chatted about having you on the show, you brought up a list of topics that you wanted to talk about, but the one that kind of jumped out at me had to do with this thing we were just talking about, which is this concept of sidekicks, right? So this younger hero to parent dynamic, younger hero to older hero dynamic, that kind of thing, and how they pull it off, not just in Young Justice, but in DC Comics in general. So what is it about the sidekicks and the sidekick superhero like relationship dynamic that made that be one of your top topics you wanted to talk about?
So first, thank you for calling me a person who knows story, because if I was going to be known as one thing, I think that would be a big deal for me. I want people to know that I understand and that I love telling stories, and hopefully the fact that I do it so often means I know a couple things about it. The other thing I do want to just touch on real quick is when it comes to Have Spellbook, I do have a partner named Rudy Basso who is also a master storyteller and gets a lot of the sort of ideas for arcs and things, and we work on that together hand in hand. He's amazing. So I just wanted to shout him out as well. But yes, sidekicks. So what's fascinating to me about sidekicks are, I think a lot of people don't like superhero sidekick relationships, or they get to a point in life, often when they're teenagers, if they've liked these comic books before, where they sort of shrug them off because it feels not cool. It feels uninteresting, and I think that is some BS you learn as an adult, that these stories are super duper compelling. And because you've got these adult teams that are popular in a lot of other comic books, right? Marvel likes their adult teams, the Fantastic Four, the X-Men, the Avengers. But this dynamic of superhero and sidekick is just done so well by DC. And then the idea of taking a team of people who are sidekicks is great. And I think we as teenagers, and when I say we, I mean like the collective comic book reader, we reject the idea of superheroes and sidekicks as lame. It's because the sidekicks are reminding us of us. And as I was watching this, I was like, oh, some of the sidekicks are sort of rejecting the idea that they are just a sidekick, right? By joining this team, by wanting to join the Justice League. And so it really does become fascinating. It's like, oh, maybe because we see so much of ourselves in sidekicks, and to us it's like, well, this sidekick should be off on his own, doing adult things, having adult adventures, that's why we reject that. And then you look at the relationships between the sidekicks and their superhero counterparts, or between the sidekicks and their parents, and there's just so much complexity there, especially now that I'm older and I have friends who are parents and I have people who are younger that I'm looking after and mentoring. You're like, oh, it's not just complicated from the sidekick side. It's very, very complicated from the superhero or adult side as well. Like, there are layers to these things, and it's fascinating to me. And it becomes, like everything in comic books, because the stakes are so high, those layers become even more complicated. The superheroes are asking children to put their lives on the line. And that's when you see that, you see like, this is why they're telling them, maybe you're not ready for the Justice League yet, because the problems we deal with, practically kill us all the time. So why would I bring you into that? I've already risked so much of you. So to me, that's like the fascinating thing is there's this parental dynamic that's filled with complicated emotions and filled with the way these characters care about each other that you see, and each one is totally unique, right? Like, I feel like up until now I've been generalizing, saying this is how the sidekicks feel, this is how the heroes feel, but every sidekick and hero relationship is so different, just like every parent-child relationship is so different, or every, sibling relationship is different. And I love to see the dynamics there. You brought up Superman and Superboy, and that is just one of the most compelling pieces of the first season. Is Superman gets, informed like, hey, we have this clone of you who, is totally lost in this world and could use your help. And even Batman is there saying like, hey, buddy, you've got to step up. You've got to do the right thing. And Superman can't handle it. He can, he's Superman. He can do anything. He's the all-American dream. And he, truth, justice, the American way, yada, yada. And he can't handle this crazy, emotional, complicated problem thrown at him. And it makes Superboy lash out in crazy ways. And I think it's also part of the reason in the first season he gets drawn to Lex and, wants to essentially, right, use drugs that make him more like Superman because, maybe that will get his dad, quote unquote, to pay attention to him finally.
Yeah, there is so much going on to unpack in that. But I tell you, I'm sure I've said it before, but the day that Bruce Wayne sits you down in a diner to give you parenting advice is a bad day for you, buddy.
It really is.
Right.
Yeah.
And the idea, I love how you're saying this, and it gets even, one of the things I thought of when you were talking about this is that it gets even more layered. So we have like a direct dynamic where, say, Superboy, who has no parents, human grew up around them parents, right, is this child who is presenting himself to a father who never knew he existed, right, and has a complicated, relationship, right? And then you have Wally, right, who has his own parents but his mentor is technically a relative, right? The Flash is technically his uncle.
Yeah.
So he does have that kind of thing where he's got a relationship with his parents and he's got a relationship with Barry, right? You get Robin, who is adopted. So Bruce is absolutely his father, right? So, but an adoptive dynamic, right? You've got Artemis coming from a broken home, who was trained by her dad and mom, presumably, before she had her accident, right? To have all these abilities, but then is dismissing all of that and turning to someone like Green Arrow for that dynamic. So all these complicated and then you get a character like Blue Beetle in the second season. And Blue didn't get Ted Kord. He didn't get the original Blue Beetle to be his mentor because Ted died. Mm-hmm. Yet we know from the comics that because Blue was a minor, the League, before even approaching Blue, the League approached Blue's parents, Jaime's parents, first to say, look, this is what's going on with your son. First of all, you need to know this is happening. And second of all, we need to ask your permission to be able to help him do this. And they gave permission before Blue was even asked onto the team. So, and the same thing happened with Artemis and her mom as well. That Green Arrow and Batman had approached her. And so it's not just these parental almost dynamics with the superhero that's their mentor, but it's also that complicated dynamic of there's mentor / parent and there's actual parent, right? That needs to do that. And in some cases, the parents are superpowered or part of the community. And in some cases, like Wally's parents, they're just middle-class people going to school. I don't even know what his parents do in this series. But like his mom could be his teacher and his dad could be, working. Maybe they're both teachers. I don't know. But they're just living an everyday life. And they just nod acceptingly and, give him the support that he needs and try to parent him. It's just so complicated. And in an ensemble cast, like in Young Justice, this ensemble cast, you have to balance all of these things while still making everybody compelling and moving the superhero plot forward and still addressing these issues in various ways. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's incredible.
It is. It gets really incredible, and it gets really incredibly complicated. The Dr. Fate storyline with...
Oh, God.
Right?
Man. It's all right. I forgot about that. Now I'm going to cry.
Yeah, the fact that there's this very interesting, we start with this dynamic with Zatanna and Zatara, and, her dad is clearly a little protective, isn't sure about her joining the team, right? And so you get that dynamic, and it's very, very, very something we're used to, right? It's a dynamic we've seen before in not just comic books, but in like any father-daughter fictional relationship. There's like this overprotective dad instinct. But then when this whole Dr. Fate bomb drops and, he accepts the mantle of Dr. Fate to protect his daughter, it takes that to a new level and it makes it more meaningful. We could talk about overprotective dads all day because I'm sure as a father of a daughter, you have your own opinions, right? And I think it gets played out, but this makes it like, whoa, this guy is legit, and he is willing to do what it actually takes to take care of his child. And then, like you said, big ensemble cast, there's lots of ground to cover because that sacrifice is so meaningful. Every single time you see Dr. Fate, you are reminded of that, and you're like, I would be like, oh my God, and my heart would hurt, and, I would remember that story and how painful this was for her and how painful it must be for him. And it's crazy.
I think it's important to note too, like I'm glad you were saying like the overprotective father and not the overprotective father of a girl, because I think it's pretty key in the show that he's overprotective because her mom is dead and she is his only child. He never says anything about the fact that she's a girl. Right. It is not because that she's a girl. And it seems like a subtle thing, but I think it's extremely important. He has a lot of respect for her. He just is very protective of her because she is all he has left, right? Of his wife and of his family. And that whole storyline, considering again, the type of things like, I love this phrase that Jason Spizak used when he was on the show. He said, what kind of credit do we all get for making so many emotional deposits into the bank that you can make a withdrawal like this, right? Zatanna does not have that many scenes in this series. Zatanna and Sitara they are definitely a solid part of the series, but really, how many scenes do we really get with them, considering the absolutely, like, the weight of that scene that I carry with me? Right? I'm sorry, I'm having a hard time not breaking into tears currently. No
Sure.
hyperbole. Just picturing that moment where he kisses her on the forehead. I'm losing it. Forget it. Kisses her on the forehead and then puts the helmet on. But in addition to her complexity of the fact that he's doing this because of a choice she made, right? And oh my God, like that whole complex dynamic. And then that in the very final scene, I think we're going to dive into this a little bit more a little later, but that's just the finale.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact that they took, and maybe you could speak to this as an actual producer of TV, right? That scene where they finally take down Dr. Fate and they allow Zatanna the 3-4 seconds of screen time to have a moment where she tries to save her dad.
Mm-hmm.
Right? They did not have to put that in.
No.
They could have glossed right over it. It would not have changed anything. But instead, the writers and creators give her the respect of that line of, I can save Fate from Savage, but I can't save my father from Fate. God, what an amazing line. And the fact that they were able to do these punches in these little snippets. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So can you speak to that, like the idea of making choices about kind of what goes into and what doesn't go into something that you're trying to produce?
Yeah, and it is with a show that has this many characters, and it's almost like every episode, you know, there's a dare where they're like, sure, we'll take on 3 more characters and try to, you know, bring that story in and weave that in. And these people do it. They do it right. And the one thing you want to do, I think, when you're doing this is constantly be reminding people about your characters that you have, even if they're not featured in an episode, right? So if we see Dr. Fate, you know, for a quick 3 seconds in an episode where the Justice League is coming down and they're fighting people and helping out the team, you know, I think that is important. So that's the first thing, is you want to be kind to your tomorrow self by giving yourself, like, okay, who else can we have in this scene? How many characters can we animate? We can animate 6. Well, let's not have 5. Let's put all 6 in there so that we remind our viewers this person is still here. They're still part of this story. They're still important. So that's the first thing, is, you know, you can't be lazy when you have a story like this. You have to use all of your resources to try to remind people when you can, because then you're going to have scenes where it's like really important to just have Superboy and Miss Martian on the screen, you know, or to just have, one of the young people talking to Black Canary and confessing something. So like those are your really important scenes. So you want to milk the scenes where you can have lots of characters for all they're worth. The other thing you want to do is, I think you need to think about what you've done in the past and respect that when you're making a show like this. So you need to think about, when you're writing something, oh man, if this is what's happening, right? If what we've got here is a situation where Dr. Fate, you know, like there's going to be a character could make a hard choice, even though it's not the focus of the scene or has something to say, we need to make sure that's commented on. Like, you know, it's almost like if you're writing a scene where a bunch of people are together and 2 people who used to be in love, who had a terrible breakup, have to interact with each other, you're going to want to reference that. You're not just going to want to have those people go through the motions and fight back to back and not have some sort of tension either indicated in the way that they're animated or in the way that they speak to each other. You need to put that there. So it's keeping track of those relationships is very important. I don't know how they manage it with this many characters. We have to do it on Have Spellbook sometimes because we have a lot of characters. And
you do, yeah.
And so that's the one thing, is sort of not. The other thing is, and this is lazy writing, you see a lot in TV shows where certain things become shorthand, right? So like if you watch let's say the first season of Friends, which may not be applicable to your audience, but a lot of people watched Friends. Joey, the character of Joey, is not as dumb in the first season of Friends as he becomes by the end of Friends.
Yep.
You know, Ross is not as neurotic in the first episode of Friends as he is by the last episode of Friends. And so those sorts of things become shorthand, and it becomes easy to say, like, oh, well, our audience knows this is the dumb character. We'll just have them make a joke about how dumb they are, or this is the hungry character, and we'll have them make a joke about how hungry they are and move on. Good shows say, you know what? Joey shouldn't be getting stupider. Joey should be getting smarter as he goes on. He starts in his mid-20s, some might argue the stupidest points in our life, and gets much smarter. And this show does that. So, right, they look at her and they say, okay, she's had years now to deal with the fact that she did this, the guilt associated with turning her father into Dr. Fate, because of a choice that she made. She's got, what would she actually say? What would be her reflection? She wouldn't just shout no. She wouldn't ignore it because, it's been here long enough and the audience accepts it, so she should. She would have this very meaningful, heartfelt thing to say says 7 million other things in that one sentence. So that's how you got to address it, is you got to stay on top of how you think your characters are developing.
And in a little bit of maybe a little bit of an aside anyway, but the scene where they're making a decision in the first season, where the Justice League are all sitting around the table making a decision on who they're going to, how they're going to expand out the Justice League, that led to that brilliant, like, so iconic scene where Batman admits that he knew that Captain Marvel was a 10-year-old the whole time.
Yeah.
And Wonder Woman is like the stand-in for the stereotypical audience member, right? Who is saying, well, why am I not surprised? You introduced this small child into crime fighting at the ripe old age of 9 or 8, and you did it so that he would be like you. He says, I did it because he needed to bring in the people that killed his parents.
Right.
And she said, so he could become like you. And then there's that beat pause, and he says, so that he wouldn't. Which tells us something key as well about this Batman, is that in the comics, when I was growing up, Batman did not know who killed his parents. That had been a mystery for decades. And it wasn't until the mid to late 80s that they revealed this idea of this just an everyday guy named Joe Chill, who gunned his parents down. And Batman, there was a story arc where Batman goes and confronts him about this, and then what were the consequences of him actually finally going through with, was he going to stop being Batman and that kind of stuff, right? So there's that scene, right? But in relation to the Fate scene, also it gets brought up, like, why is he here? Why is Fate sitting at this table right now, who just did this horrible thing to someone, right? And then him saying, Zatara wants me to be here so you can keep an eye on me. And you're like, well, that tracks. Okay, I get that. That makes sense, right? But then also when they're like, oh, well, let's bring Zatanna onto the team. And he's all, no,
Yeah.
Like, interesting. Who's in there right now advising you? Right?
Exactly. Yeah. Like, oh, he's got a little bit of influence over Fate, and it's in matters that are so powerful, right? Like, it's in matters of, like, this is my daughter, and I'm gonna have a little bit of influence on you, Fate. So,
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah, so interesting.
I love that you brought up that Batman scene where Wonder Woman says that to him, because I do think that's also an example of where they go a little bit further and a little bit harder with the writing than if it were lazy writing, you'd have Wonder Woman say that line and then you'd end the scene on that laugh. But to the fact that Batman then says that, and then it also harkens back to when Dick Grayson is talking with Black Canary and says to her, I always thought I wanted to be Batman, and now I realize I don't. Like, it's, when that scene happens, it's just such an encapsulation of who Dick Grayson is and who he's going to become. And that affirmation from Batman is like, oh, Batman doesn't really want that for you either, right? He wants something better for you too. And it's an interesting recognition of Batman's own flaws. And I think we have that, right? When we were talking about the parental relationship, we have that. When we're parents or when we're mentoring somebody, we don't want them to make the mistakes we did. We don't want them to, relive those, have those pains we had. But it goes even deeper than that. It's like, we don't want you to be who we are. We want you to be someone better than we are. And it's like, well, this person is going to be human. They're going to make their own mistakes. They're going to have their own baggage. Yep. And yet, and you know that as an adult, that Batman's one of the smartest people around, right? He knows that. But at the same time, his humanity drives him to push for more for, Dick Grayson and Tim Drake and stuff. So it's powerful stuff.
I think it's really indicative too of something more subtle. And again, it gets back to this writing, this ability to have a handful of lines that push plot forward, that give information about the world, and that drives character development. Mm-hmm. That scene with Dick happened in Disordered, which is the episode after Failsafe, right? So he leads the team in Failsafe, which is that Matrix-like dream episode. And everybody dies, right?
Right.
And so it's the story. It's the Black Canary, chats where he's sitting there, saying like, my first mission, and basically the world ended. Mm-hmm. And I get that it wasn't real, but all of these choices were real, and the choices I had to make, which are choices I felt like Batman would make, I will carry these in a dark part of my heart for the rest of my life for having made these decisions. And I don't know if I want to do that anymore. But here's the thing. That scene where Batman is admitting that he did not want that for Robin, that he has never wanted Robin to grow up to become him, happened way after that conversation with Black Canary, which tells you that even though they both want the same thing for Dick, Bruce has never, ever told Dick that, which also means that he wants Dick to be able to make his own decisions about what it is that he's going to become and why. They did not sit in the mansion at home and have Bruce Wayne tell him what he's going to be growing up. That I don't want you to be Batman. I don't want you to be this. I want you to be your own person. He's literally letting Dick come to those conclusions and decisions on his own. That is the most painful and difficult, one of the most painful and difficult parts of parenting. Mm-hmm. Is actually letting your kids have consequences to their choices, therefore giving them the strength to make those choices themselves without depending on someone else. It's really hard. And to have that encapsulated in these two scenes that are a total of probably, I want to say maybe 2 minutes of screen time, probably less, that 120 seconds of screen time or less, to have that much layered story being told in one shot. Crazy.
Yeah, it really, really is. That's just good writing. And it's one of those things we do a lot in marketing writing. I was talking about promos earlier, is like, how do you get the substance and the emotion, and you've only got 30 seconds to do it, right? And then, sure, I'm trying to sell the newest season of, Locked Up Abroad when I'm doing that. But I do think that you can take a lot from those things. And you can also take a lot from this show because it also lets moments play out. The animation is good, and so good that you can read subtleties into people's faces, even when they're wearing masks. In an animated show, like that's really, really crazy. And often the scenes end with some sort of meaningful look from one character to another, or somebody walking in a particular way. And the fact that this show has the balls to do that is really important, and also teaches us a ton about the way the different characters feel about each other. And I think it becomes very layered in the second season when you've got sidekicks and, former sidekicks working alongside each other, and heroes, right? Like when you've got Batman and Tim Drake and Nightwing all in the same sort of scene, that's like a very complicated relationship, especially if Batman's been gone for a year, because Tim Drake has been kind of looking up to Nightwing the way he might if Batman were there. So it becomes very interesting.
Yeah. And what's interesting to me is actually, believe it or not, it's just something I just thought of. Mm-hmm. Basically, Beast Boy is the sidekick to McGann.
Yeah.
Like, she is the one that he is going to turn to because his powers are very literally a reflection of her powers. Mm-hmm. And to learn how to shapeshift, to learn what to do, like what the extent of what he can do is, and those kinds of things. It does make you, I mean, he definitely gets the shapeshifting powers, but it just makes you wonder, like, what else he can potentially do, or why he's choosing this power set. In the comics, at some point, he actually, if I remember correctly, somebody might correct me if I'm wrong, but there was a time when he was learning how to actually shapeshift into not just animals. Mm-hmm. So, like, shifting his features to look like different people and things like that. But in the comics, it wasn't that emphasized. It was probably a side story somewhere, where in this show, oh my gosh, he's only 13 in season 2. Mm-hmm. So if we do another 3 to 5 year time jump, he's going to be 18. So he's going to be the age that Nightwing was in season 2. Where is his powers going to go from there, and what can he do, and how is it going to be a reflection of the mentorship? So someone where Miss Martian had been a mentor to John, I mean, had been John had been a mentor to McGann, and now McGann is being a mentor to, and this is another aspect of the show that's so brilliant. The time jump to me is absolute genius. And it was frustrating to some people because they were confused and they wanted to know what was going on in between the years and that kind of stuff. But the implications from a storytelling standpoint, that one, you have literal timestamps, that the story arc is moving forward whether we're paying attention to something or not, whether the spotlight is on a particular part of the universe or a particular part of the villainous cadre in the world or not. And the fact that these characters age and grow and mature is making it an entirely different kind of animated series than anything I can think of. I mean, even with maybe the exception of the jump between Avatar: The Last Airbender and the 70, 80-year jump to Korra.
Sure.
Maybe.
Yeah.
Right? And we get to see some glimpses of Aang having grown up and Katara having grown up and that kind of thing. But those were still like inferred, as opposed to we're watching it happen in front of us. And that maturity and changing. And the dynamics you're talking about changing, right? Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That change from sidekick to superhero or sidekick to colleague. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean?
It's a thing. You don't even get it in a lot of, adult animation, I guess. I'm trying to think of dramatic adult animation, and a lot of it would be anime, right? That we see. We don't get a lot of great things that aren't part of the DCU, in my experience. I'm sure listeners definitely know of stuff here and there, but the fact that you would do a series and you would take jumps like this is also not a thing you see a ton on television with actors, because to do that, the actors need to age, right? And so it's a thing that's sort of distinctly unique with animation, because you can keep the same actors, right? They can have the same voice actors and the same through line, somebody who understands the arc of this character in the story without, and change the appearance and change the age. And, you can change the way they sound just by changing your voice. And so there's some really, really powerful stuff there. And it is interesting because I do think you get to see the effects of, when you watch season 2 and Nightwing is leading the team, you get to see sort of the influence of there's shades of Batman in there, right? But it's also wholly a way Dick Grayson would do it. And so it's really fascinating to see that sort of trickle down effect. And it's great to see that effect when he's talking to Tim. It's like, oh, that sounds like something maybe Batman would say, but then it's tempered with, either Dick Grayson's delivery or like a show of some warmer emotion behind the words, which right. I think makes all the difference, and sort of makes all the difference for Dick, because in that I see this is how Dick Grayson wanted Batman to talk to him. Right? And so it's how he's going to talk to Tim. And so I think you get to see some of that. It's really interesting. And I love the McGann relationship with Beast Boy, because what's fascinating about McGann's relationship with John is the fact that, like, she deals with some stuff because she's a teenage girl. And when she joins, she's the only teenage girl on the team. And that stuff that, like, him being a Martian and being a male, he is, like, not at all equipped to deal with, and doesn't he, like, they don't even bother sort of talking to each other. Like, he doesn't know how to deal with Wally constantly hitting on him, you know, and so he doesn't know how to, so there's these interesting pressures she has that remind me of, like, well, if you were a single dad, here are some things you might be clueless about, right? And so he's got that, and he's great at leading her in these other areas and helping her out with other things. And then there are just these big gaps in his knowledge where he just is not helpful at all. And, you know, her relationship with Beast Boy is interesting because she is very helpful to him. They are very affectionate and clearly like each other a lot, to the point where, like, he is unbridled enthusiasm her cheerleader. You know, and he is through that there in a different way, but just as much for her as she is for him. And there's, like, no sort of angst about that, which is great.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. So, I mean, DC, okay, so DC is well known for, if there's one distinction, there's a couple distinctions between DC Comics and Marvel Comics, right? But
Sure.
one of the big distinctions between DC and Marvel is this devotion to legacy heroes.
Yes.
Right? You basically have maybe X-23 to Wolverine and
Right.
Maybe the new Ironheart to Iron Man. You know, but I can't think of that many more legacy characters where DC is freaking chock full of them. You know?
Sure. Yeah.
Are there particular pairings in the show that jumped out at you that, I mean, we've talked a lot about Superboy, we've talked about Batman and Robin and McGann and Beast Boy, but what other, these are particularly unique, but what other ones, what other dynamics did you pull out as you were watching it? And I'd also like to hear maybe if there's some reflection on what you were viewing as being a producer, someone who's produced these things, like how they emphasized certain things to make the feelings that you had about these dynamics, like Wonder Woman and Wonder Girl maybe, or Aquaman and Aqualad, or any of the dynamics.
Yeah. The Flash family is fascinating, right? Because in Young Justice, you get, like, 4 different Flashes.
Right.
You know, you get Barry Allen and you get... so that is super duper fascinating to me, especially when Jay Garrick shows up, because I think there's a little bit of, like, it's interesting to see someone who is considered the Flash, right? Barry Allen being considered, like, the Flash in this series. But then you've got Jay Garrick who shows up, and it's like, well, you know, if we were going to say somebody was the Flash, are we going to say it's Jay Garrick maybe? You know, so I think that dynamic is very interesting, especially because, you know, Flashes throughout history and throughout the history of the comics, particularly in recent history, are supposed to, you know, be sort of impulsive. And we get to see what that looks like at all different stages in a person's development. And we get to see them reminding each other of each other. And what is fascinating to me is Wally giving up his, you know, superhero life and then jumping back into it, right? And this whole idea of that they seed throughout that ultimately leads to his demise. We're allowed to totally spoil everything on this, right?
Oh, I gave a spoiler warning at the beginning.
So that ultimately leads to his demise is seeded throughout that season of you're not as fast as we are. You're not even as fast as Impulse, who is the younger version of you. But he's okay with that. And there, you know, ultimately everybody else is also okay with that because he has chosen to live a different kind of life. And he's chosen, you know, happiness. And, like, I would have loved to have seen the process that he had to go through to get there, right? But we don't see that. And that's a whole series in and of itself. But like to see that and to see the dynamic of all of them coming to terms with it and being okay with it, but then still able to rag on him like, hey, can't keep up with us, you're not fast enough, and to have that whole dynamic is a really fascinating one that reminds me almost of, instead of generations of people, brothers, because I think they're all so similar that you've got like an older brother, and a younger brother, and you've got this really young, annoying, impulsive brother. And then Jay Garrick is almost like, the brother who's away at college who comes back and is like, oh, well, let me suit up and go out with you guys again. So I love that. And I love the dynamic between Aquaman and Aqualad. And I think that gets super complicated in season 2 when you bring in Black Manta, right?
Oh, yeah, for sure. And the fact that, God, there's so much going on. And you know what I was just thinking, we're going to talk about Aqualad here. The thing I was just thinking of is this idea that almost every one of these dynamics, when you think about them in the context of the 5-year jump between seasons, I would be like, oh, I want to see a whole year like of an animated series just focusing on what happened with Beast Boy up to his mom dying, and like where these tie-in comics actually come into it, because we get to see how and why his mom died in the comics. You could have a whole like mini series of comics just focusing on, Wally and Barry and Wally's choices in the middle 5 years and all this kind of stuff. There's so much of that's available. And the same with Aqualad, because there's so much we don't know about him. Okay, so clearly he's Black Manta's biological son, but he's being raised by 2 parents, one of them being Calvin Durham, who was a surface dweller who was genetically modified to be an Atlantean. Theoretically, in the comics anyway, Calvin Durham worked for Black Manta and was supposed to be a spy in Atlantis to try and undermine Aquaman, and he ended up becoming an ally of Aquaman. So, did Calder know? I don't even know if Calder knew he was adopted.
Right.
Like, did he think Calvin Durham is his actual dad, and his mom, who I can't pronounce her name, it's got like 4 apostrophes in it. What, like, is that his actual mom, and then she had an affair with Black Man? Like, we don't know anything about any of this dynamic, or even how much Calder knew, because in the video game, it's Black Manta who drops the hint to Aqualad that he needs to talk to Aquaman about who his real father is, which also leads to a whole nother set of questions. Like, if Black Manta knew the whole time, he had to be making a choice every time he was interacting with this kid to not say anything until that one moment. So did he just find out, or did he know the whole time? Or there's so much going on there, And it's such an interesting dynamic too, because, like, he's totally cool with spying on his dad. Calder is an incredible character, and is this incredible character who also, is the unexpected leader at the beginning of the series, and it totally makes sense. When he gets plugged in, it's like, oh no, that's a great choice. And so to see his relationship, especially in the episode where he goes back home in the first season, and is interacting with Aquaman, is very interesting, because there's also this like more official process through which he becomes the new Aqualad, right? Like, he's offered it. He's offered the mantle. It's not a thing that he's thrust into because because of his lineage, or because he suffers a horrible accident, or he does this very heroic thing and he's offered the mantle of Aqualad and he takes it. And so, like, their relationship, while I do think it is an affectionate one and one where they care about each other, is more professional in some ways, Yeah, good point. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So I think that is, that's really interesting. And it also, like, it's weird because Black Manta is not the only evil dad on the show, right?
Right.
Sportsmaster, worst name in DC Comics, is
worst human, almost, like, God, that guy.
Yeah. He's a terrible dad, and, like, unlike Black Manta, like, I feel bad for Black Manta, despite all the terrible stuff he's done. I feel bad for him. when his son turns on him, and you're like, oh man, this guy fell for it because he loves this kid. Whereas Sportsmaster is willing to sell anybody up the river to make a couple bucks, including his daughters, you know? So, yeah, it's messed up.
Oh, absolutely messed up. Mm-hmm. And then you get like a whole different dynamic with Wonder Woman and the Cassie Sandsmark Wonder Girl in the second season. Just, again, that one clip in that fight where there's all the sidekicks fighting with all of their mentors, and Wonder Woman's all a little less fangirl, a little more Wonder Girl. And you're like, in that one line, you get absolutely the description of whatever their dynamic is. Mm-hmm. And it's immediately different than the Bat family all fighting together and Superboy and Superman having more of kind of a brotherly relationship in that, by that point, you know, like incredible pieces of storytelling. Well, but there are a lot of scenes, as we've talked about, that show that highlight that sidekick dynamic. But the one that drove it home for me actually was the final fight scene in the first season, right? Especially that conflict between Batman and Robin and Superman and Superboy, where that sidekick dynamic we've been watching the whole time in that first season is gone. Like, they're forced into a dynamic of having to not be under their shadows anymore. Right? Yeah. What did you think about all of that coming together in that finale?
First of all, amazing. That's another example of they were seeding that from the beginning, right? This whole idea of a mole. There's a mole, there's a mole, there's a mole. And then making it, well, the mole doesn't really know they're a mole. And that is like, oh, okay, we just immediately accept that there's this form of mind control, right? And then when it happens to the whole Justice League very quickly, it doesn't feel forced. It doesn't feel, hackneyed. It's like, oh, okay, this is happening. And then you get what everybody wants to see, which is some superheroes punching each other in the face. But in this case, the sidekicks, right, versus the heroes, if you will. And I put that in air quotes for the podcast audience because they're all heroes, right?
Right.
And so, but yeah, that fight scene in particular is great because at that point, most of the other heroes have, snapped out of it. They've been returned to normal in some way. And yet, these two very powerful beings, Batman and Superman, are still super hard to take down, and it becomes up to their sidekicks to take them down. So, like you said, it's a metaphor for literally shirking off the shadows that these people have. And I think it's sort of a metaphor for Superman and Batman struggling as mentors, right? That they need to be able to let go and let their people do their thing. Like you said, it's one of the hardest things for a parent to do, but they also need to be able to embrace the decisions these people are making. And so I think it's super meaningful for Superboy because he needs to, he struggles with throughout that entire first season not being good enough to be Superman, right? And so literally beating Superman, I think, gets him there. Right. And Robin, it's just such a more interesting dynamic. It's not as forward facing because I think Robin is in some ways fighting himself, right? He is fighting the person he could become. And so that's, I think that the fact that they overcome that and the fact that they overcome it through teamwork, too, is really interesting because Batman and Superman's dynamic between those two heroes, right, is fraught. Certainly, if you look at history, right, it's fraught with very interesting things, and they're friends, and they work great together, and they remove all the kryptonite from Earth in some comic books. But I think it's interesting to see, hey, look, this is also the younger generation can get along better than the older generation can, which is, that's sort of a thematic thing we see in a lot of stories and in our world, right? In general, the young are a little bit more progressive and tolerant than the older generations. I loved that scene. It's so good. And also, just from the point of watching that fight is always great. Yeah.
I mean, you're not going to see... I don't think I'm sure this has got to have happened at some point, but you're not going to see Superman fastball specialing Batman. No, but you literally see Superboy hurling Robin through the air.
Exactly.
It's interesting this idea that it's not just the teamwork, but and that Superboy kind of faces that argument he's been having with himself the whole season, it is actually who he is that allows him to beat Superman. The fact that he's half Kryptonian and not full Kryptonian, meaning that he can keep the hold going on while the kryptonite is with them. And it hurts him, but it's not going to take him down in the same way. So it's that thing that makes him unique is what helps him take down Superman. So many layers to that. But okay, so speaking of finales, there was another thing that was on your list of 6 things you wanted to talk about. We picked this one to do a deep dive on. But I do want to make a bit of a note of this other one you were talking about, which, particularly coming from your professional background, this idea of how to end a story, but specifically about almost abrupt or unexpected endings, right? Which we get in, unfortunately, season 2. But can you dive into what it is you wanted to talk about there, what your thoughts are on those?
So real quick, this is how most TV series end, right? Not every TV series goes on and on for 10 or 7 or whatever seasons and you have a nice planned end. A lot of TV series are lucky to get 2, 1, 3 seasons and then have this very abrupt end, or have this sort of in limbo, oh, well, we should end the story because maybe we're going to come back, but we won't know until after we've released the last episode.
Right. Yep.
And so I think that a lot of TV series that do that, you have 2 decisions when the abrupt ending comes up. And a lot of people make the decision of just trying to, wrap off what they have and, not wrapping everything up in a bow. And, you see this a lot in the writer's strike that happened back in 2008.
Oh, right. Yeah.
The writer's strike, you look at a lot of dramas because, the comedies sort of came back. And there's reasons for that we don't need to get into. But a lot of dramas just cut off their season when the strike happened. And stories just never recovered. Heroes is, I think, one of the great examples.
Was super affected. Yeah, absolutely.
Just never recovered from that. And so I think when you have this abrupt ending to a series, what you need to do is you need to make sure that you are at least acknowledging a lot of your storylines. You brought up the Zatara, Dr. Fate thing. That is a great acknowledgement of that storyline without a full 10-minute struggle between her and Dr. Fate, where she tries to save her dad and then she can't, and which also would have been satisfying. That line is also satisfying. That nod to it is satisfying. What happens with Wally is fascinating at the end of season 2, because he's not an enormous character as far as screen time goes in season 2, right? We're spending a lot of time with a lot of other characters, and that is fascinating that he's the one they choose because they know he's still meaningful to the audience. They know that the fact that he hasn't been in the game is what is going to be sort of his undoing, that he's not as fast, or, so you've got these really interesting things. And so when you're tying something up, I think it's good to at least acknowledge things, but also make sure that your big storyline is the thing that takes priority, right? So don't spend too much time. If there's a romance that your fans loved, have a nod to that romance, but don't make the whole episode about that romance unless that's what your story has been about this whole time. It's really that's how you get that satisfying ending when it comes up abruptly.
Yeah, this idea that people are like, oh, well, season 1, season 2 ended on cliffhangers. Technically, those aren't cliffhangers. They wrapped First of all, they wrapped everything up from the season, season 1. Let's look at season 1, right? They wrapped everything up that were questions that we were offered. What is happening? What's the light doing? What is this? Why did they steal the piece of Starro? And, all of these things. What is it that they're doing? That all got answered. We do have a few loose strings, though. The 16 hours. Well, that was introduced literally in that one episode. This is not something that there was a missing 16 hours from the second episode that we never got an answer to in 26 episodes, right? They've wrapped up and given answers to the questions that they've brought up earlier on in the season, while still leaving a few loose strings. Same thing in season 2. There's still more plotting and planning that Savage is clearly doing with Darkseid and Apocalypse that stretches all the way back to season 1. Yet somehow it's a very satisfying ending, right? You get answers to all your questions. You understand what the Reach is. You understand the Reach is resolved and they're off planet, and we know what's going on with that and what's been going on with Blue, and his thing's been resolved and who he is and what he's doing, and all of these questions are getting wrapped up and getting answered, except for, okay, also this 1 or 2 loose strings of Savage now has the War World, which he clearly maneuvered to get. Lex Luthor has somehow now, managed to maneuver himself as the savior of the planet. Right?
Exactly, yeah.
And we get our first glimpse of Darkseid, who we've gotten hints that was going to show up since the very beginning of season 1.
Yeah, totally.
But again, like that balancing those things out, it's so crazy to do. But a cliffhanger technically is like, okay, someone is literally falling off a cliff and may die, and that's the last episode of the season.
Yeah.
Right? And that's not what happened.
Stories are life, right? You can leave stories open if you need to leave them open. That's totally cool. But definitely acknowledge that story, right? Like maybe we don't know what's going to happen with, Wally West, right? But we know what happened to him. We know, right? We know that at the end of all things, he is still a hero. And so I think it's acknowledging that kind of stuff, acknowledging we know that this is a thing. We know there is a possible romance here. We know that maybe Connor and Megan are going to get together. Maybe they're not, because it's going to be kind of weird and creepy if he stays a young boy all the time, right? And so, but having a nod to that, I think is a really, really good thing that sort of makes the story feel that much more satisfying, because it's the author of the story saying to people, I know this is important, and it is important, but it doesn't mean that I need to wrap it all up in a bow. And I'm not going to do that at the expense of our bigger story here, which is about the Reach, So
is there anything else that you'd like to add, James? Anything that we missed? Man, we covered a lot of stuff.
We covered a ton of ground. I just want to thank you for making this podcast so that I could discover not just a wonderful television series, but also a wonderful podcast. So, and thank you for everything you do and for all you do for this community. You are a force for good, sir. And you are definitely a Dick Grayson and not a Bruce Wayne.
Thanks, man. Where can people find you out in the world on Earth Prime here so they can chat with you about all the things you just said?
So they can check out the podcasts at don'tsplitthepodcastnetwork.com, because short URLs are for babies. And they can also check out all the game design stuff I do at worldbuilderblog.me. I've got links to all of the products I talk about, building worlds and Dungeons and Dragons and all kinds of stuff there. So check that out as well.
All right. Thanks so much, man. And thanks to everyone else for sharing some time with us. You can find us on Twitter at the YJ Files, on Facebook at Crashing the Mode, on Tumblr at theyjfiles.tumblr.com, and on our website, crashingthemode.com. If you enjoy our show, please consider sharing it with a friend. You can also support the show by giving us a review on Apple Podcasts or your podcatcher of choice. The ratings really do help others find the show. If you do leave us a rating or review, please let us know, especially if you're outside the United States. We have to look a little harder to find those. And even though Season 3 has been officially announced, please continue to spread the word to friends and family about the series. Hashtag #BuyYJComics on Comixology to get us more story arcs even sooner than Season 3, and get yourself up to speed for the Season 3 premiere. And as always,
stay whelmed, everyone.
You've been listening to Whelmed, the Young Justice Files podcast. Our hosts are Rich Howard and Emily Booza. Our editor and producer is Neal Powell. Our theme was composed by Emily Mio. Our logo was created by Kevin Bates. Whelmed is a fan-made podcast and is not officially affiliated with DC Comics, DC Entertainment, Warner Brothers Animation, and any other owners of Young Justice or its related source material. As such, these companies have sole ownership of all symbols, images, names, logos, and proprietary material related to Young Justice. Original content of this podcast is ours under Creative Commons. Thanks for listening, and stay whelmed.